right, so our presentation is about a historical figure called Queen Njinga. So I'm going to just start, and we have a couple of pictures just to try and give you a graphic to put to the words, but mostly it's just going to be us sharing her story and our understanding of how her story has been interpreted. Queen Njinga, also known by her Christian name, Dona Ana de Sousa, is a political figure whose sexual and gender identity was contested even before she rose to power in the mid-17th century. Based out of what is now Angola, Njinga is known for her military tactics against Portuguese colonizing interests, as well as her strategic and violent maneuvers to consolidate her power. Most notoriously, Njinga is known for a single story, that of her meeting with... Not working out? You can just exit the slide, she's going to come back. But there's a visual of this as well. Most notoriously, Njinga is known for a single story, that of her meeting with Portuguese governor Correia Sousa to negotiate a peace treaty in 1622. She was presented with a cushion to sit on while Sousa occupied the sole chair in the room. In order to achieve equal standing with the governor, she ordered a servant to form a chair for her by kneeling on her hands and knees. This story was told by Njinga to missionary Araldi Cavazzi 30 years later, but it and other accounts of her defiance of expectations are relayed in dispatches written by Captain Fuller, a Dutch attaché, and a 1769 publication of her alleged biography by Jean-Louis Castelhon. Collectively, they described her harem of men who she deemed wives, her desire to be called king, and the male clothing she wore as she led her troops in battle. Her queerness, or in its original sense of the word, oddness, was marked by its affront to 17th and 18th century Dutch, French, and Portuguese norms. In other words, Njinga's queerness is originally a Western articulation. This articulation remains, although it has morphed over time. While early colonial writings about Njinga sensationalized and othered her gender bending, a resurgence of academic writings about Njinga focused almost exclusively over the legitimacy of her claims to power, with little commentary on her sexuality.
Around the same time, Afrikaners used Njinga's history to support an Afrocentric paradigm. According to Margaret John Hay, African nationalism during the 1960s and 70s in the United States spurred a search for queens, a search for the glorious past with a particular emphasis on the role of African women in traditional political structures. In an attempt to cure the exclusion of African women from African history and reclaim an African past, the history of various female political figures in pre-colonial Africa were romanticized, Njinga's included. The image of strong, regal African warriors and goddesses was applied to Njinga and other African women leaders, such as Ghana's Ja Asantewaa, Egypt's Cleopatra, and the Amazonian women from Dahomey. This discovery of African women's history has been a major component in Black nationalist history and has been used as a mechanism of Afrocentric ideology to foster pride in Black communities. The combination of the romanticization of African leaders and the emergence of queer theory led to contention over Njinga's meaning for Black feminists. Watt McGuffrey writes that the Nigerian anthropologist Ife Amadioum includes Western feminists, especially Americans, among other sweeping indictments of the tendency to generalize about African women and to pass judgment upon their life situations as conforming, or more often not conforming, to supposedly universal criteria of liberation and self-fulfillment. Amadioum particularly critiqued the Western feminist Audre Lorde, who used the Carrico word Zami, meaning women who love women, to emphasize a queer relationship between all Black women. Lorde also alludes to a sense of queerness of Dahomean Amazons in her writings as a way to bridge Black women together. For Lorde, queerness globally bonds Black women, but this reading is not always welcomed by African scholars like Amadioum.
The growth in queer theory and the global growth in gay and lesbian recognition have indeed led to a newer trend in how Njinga's history has been contextualized. Rather than emphasize Njinga's queerness to other her, Western writings now emphasize Njinga's queerness to fold her under a queer umbrella that transcends the Atlantic. The Western writings that once declared difference now declare sameness. In popular cyber media and much academic and quasi-academic writing, Njinga's sexuality is contorted to fit an agenda for historicizing marginalized sexual practice and identity. On the academic end, in Boy Wives and Female Husbands, Steve Murray and Will Roscoe use Njinga as an opening case study to illustrate a tradition of same-sex sexuality across Africa. In this way, Njinga is folded into a queer theorist's attempt to queer a historic, pre-colonial Africa. She is also cited as an example of gender bending with a suggestion of transgender practice in non-academic works like Amara Das Wilhelm's Tritiya Praktik, People of the Third Sex, and Mercedes Allen's Transgender History, Trans-Expression in Ancient Times. Njinga is credited as being outright bisexual in Angie Bowie's informal collection of so-called bisexual figures. These works almost always cite variations on the same story Njinga once told Araldi Kavazi as evidence for her queerness. Perhaps the most interesting co-optation of the story is in Female Dominance, Rituals and Practices, a guidebook on bondage with female doms. Author Claudia Barron casually cites Njinga as an example of such female dominance in demanding her male servant act as her chair. Notice that in Njinga's original telling, through the lens of Kawazi, the servant was female. We don't actually know the gender of the servant. Dare we say, but it seems to us that framing Njinga as queer, trans, bisexual, or a dominatrix, all comparatively recent articulations of sexual identity, is ridiculous.
It may also be a recolonization of African sexuality. The idea of queerness or homosexuality in many Black communities has come to be treated as myth. Roscoe and Murray explains Afrocentricity as a way for African Americans to look to traditional African ways and weed out what is non-traditional. Same-sex sexuality did not make the cut. Gay and lesbian experience is popularly considered to be unnatural to Africans due to a history of stigmatization of sexual practices and a colonial legacy. Belief in the myth of heterosexuality in Africa is fueled by the belief that homosexuality is purely a Western phenomenon introduced to Africa through the repercussions of Western imperialism. However, it was the infiltration of missionaries and colonial authorities that first labeled non-heterosexual practices in African tradition as unnatural. In truth, homophobia, not homosexuality, was the Western import through this missionary and colonial exploitation. Attempts to read Njinga as queer, therefore, is both perceived as polluting the pride of Black nationalism and perhaps more accurately, recolonizing African sexuality.
A Western lens attempting to define what constitutes queerness is always already a colonialist lens if the legacy of colonialism is acknowledged as real and present. Anne McClintock writes ironically in Imperial Leather that the term post-colonial is, in many cases, prematurely celebratory. Indeed, McClintock reminds us that the decolonization process is not over. We may be a post-colonial globe in name, but not in practice, nor in our theories. Queerness as a Western construct formed with Blackness as a Western construct. Our language for understanding race and ethnic hierarchies is equally as cemented in a colonial past as our language for understanding hierarchies of sex, gender, and sexuality. If we use the terminology queer, a Western invention itself, to acknowledge the flexibility and fluidity of threats to normative heterosexual female identities, then yes, Njinga is decidedly queer. But then so too would be Queen Elizabeth I, and with so broad a definition, the colonial baggage of claiming Njinga as queer goes unexamined. We concur that Njinga is queer in the sense of destabilizing normative female identities, but her strategy was not to queer or destabilize these hierarchies. In fact, she reinforced gender and sexual hierarchies by enacting strategies that placed her at the top, or read as king, male, in the Ndongo culture, where Ngola's kings were men like her father and brother before her. She did not openly practice same-sex sexuality, nor was she queer in the sense of dismantling binaries or hierarchies.